Hello everyone, welcome once again to the next segment of the revision series, that is the month of February. Alright, so in the month of February, it is an update from national news and international news, but also a focus on COVID-19. Whenever there will be significant COVID related news, we are going to cover it in the revision series at a separate heading. Alright, so let's dive into the revision series beginning with the national news. So the one big news that came in the month of February was the census of this decade have been postponed for a year. All right, the census, a decadal exercise that happens and has happened since 1872 and every year in India since our independence. All right, but for the first time the census will be delayed. All right, they will be delayed on the onus of COVID-19 because the government agencies are busy with COVID-19 work. There is limited time, and because of the risk of transmission that can happen because it happens through a door-to-door survey. Now the census of 2020 or 2021 or 2022, as you can claim, is different on two levels. One, the census of 2021-22 will also be in the format of digital. All right, digital data will be collected. Earlier it was only paper data that used to be collected, but now this year it will also be digital. All right, another thing that is important with the census. All right, so when did the first census took place? It happened in 1872 when Lord Mayo was the chancellor. All right, the viceroy of the country. Now what is census and how is it different? So the census is a decadal exercise to tabulate the citizens of the country along with how many people are residing in India at the moment and where are they residing. All right, so this is the exercise that includes all the people, that is citizens plus resident. A resident is that person who has for 180 days or more stayed in India in a year. All right, a citizen is someone who is the citizen of the country as per the Citizenship Act of 1955. All right, so the census tabulates both. Okay, now one thing that we need to understand is the NPR, the National Population Register. The NPR is a precursor to the census. All right, now how is it different from census? The NPR only tabulates all the people who are residing. It does not differentiate between citizens and resident. It is only an exercise to determine the usual residents of India. All right, so first the NPR takes place and then the census. You all know because of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the NPR exercise had been in doldrums, and therefore this is also one of the reasons for postponement of the census. Now another thing that is also important to be known, why is census and how is it governed and how is it different to any other data collected? All right, so you all know India also has a National Sample Survey Organization, NSSO. They also do surveys. We all can also do surveys, right? But the census itself is governed by the Census Act of 1948. All right, how is the census different from any other data collected? Census data cannot be shared further or monetized. It is a protected data that cannot be used for incrimination against you or cannot be used for further monetization. This is so Aadhaar data is also collected by government, but Aadhaar data can be shared by your consent to different organizations. Your Aadhaar number or your fingerprint biometric can be used by organizations. You all must have done KYC at different private companies, and you would see your Aadhaar data available with them if you provide them with the consent. But census data cannot be shared further. All right, so this is the unique aspect of census vis-a-vis any other data. So this is about the census. Distinction between citizens and resident and what the census is all about becomes important. Then PNB scam economic fugitive to be extradited. This is the news that came from United Kingdom that this year it has been confirmed that Nirav Modi, the one accused under the Punjab National Bank fraud case will now be extradited. So two things become important. What was the PNB scam? What is extradition? And on what grounds was it being held up in UK, all right, and why did the court decide on it? So first, what was the PNB scam? PNB scam, Nirav Modi was a jeweler, all right, so he had different companies and he used to sell diamond jewelry. Now, a diamond jewelry, what will be the price of a diamond jewelry? Let's say this is a box, it contains diamonds. I claim it is 100 rupees, all right. Now, how do I claim that this is of 100 rupees? I made a sale of it, all right. I sold it to someone for 100 rupees. Now, if I claim that this diamond was sold for and provide you with a bill, the only way you can ascertain that the price of the diamond is this much, either through the bill, especially for a bank. What had Nirav Modi done? He had sold his diamonds to himself through different shell companies and failed to provide letter of undertaking to the banks vis-a-vis loans. So what he did, he stated that, see, the diamonds that I am making are making this much amount of money, all right, and I need more loans. So in average of getting loans, he needed to furnish letter of undertaking. It were these letter of undertakings that were never furnished, all right, and so the loan money that was to be in return with collateral, wherein the bank would have gained access to these diamonds if the loan was not repaid. But because one, these diamonds were at an inflated price, and secondly, there were no real collateral documents that were provided for a bank to really trace where a diamond is, all right, or who has been sold to. So in that regard, this was the scam. Now he, when the scam broke out, ran away from the country, was located by an obscure journalist in United Kingdom walking on the London street. So he informed the local police and had been arrested, all right. So then Indian government and Ministry of External Affairs, which is the nodal ministry for extradition, all right, they made a request for extraditing, saying that, see, this is a person who is involved in a crime in my country, and therefore please give me this individual so that my courts can try him, all right. So Nirav Modi claimed two grounds wherein why he should not be extradited, which are also the grounds that need to be proven before extradition can take place. The first one was that there is a prima facie case made out against the offender, and whatever the case is also an offence in the country from where he's been extradited. So what was he accused of? He was accused of bank fraud. So bank fraud should be an offence not only in India but also in UK, all right. And this is not a fake case that is being made. There are real evidence that he had committed the offence. So Indian government provided the UK court with all the evidence that, see, these are the things he had done, these are the documents and evidence against him, and this is no false case. So the court said, yes, there is a prima facie case made out against the offender. The second was that the Indian courts will provide him with a fair trial. That principle of natural justice will be followed when he is tried, all right. So he claimed that, see, in Indian courts, there is no real trial that goes on. Cases go on for 15-20 years. This is the plan that Indian government has. This is a political case. They want to make me as a political voter card, which they will use for further elections. So the Indian investigative agencies claim that, see, this is the set procedure for trial. He will be tried as an economic fugitive. He will be tried under the Violation of Contract Act, all right, and therefore on those grounds, there is a set procedure. There is no place for abuse of law. He will be provided with the access to a counsel. He can pursue and fight his own case, furnish evidence, and the Indian court system is fair enough. So both these grounds were claimed that are existing, and thus his extradition has now been confirmed. Now, the Secretary of State of UK government will confirm when and how he will be extradited to India, all right. So moving on, borders between India and Pakistan fall silent for the first time since 2006. So in 2003, 4 years after the Kargil war, India and Pakistan agreed a ceasefire agreement that we will not fire shots at the line of actual control. The line of actual control was created through the Shimla Pact of 1972. All right. So that is the one big news that came out from February. India has increasingly had a hostile border with China. No country can fight a two-front war. This has been confirmed multiple times. Even the mighty Nazi Germany could not win a two-front war. The moment the second front was opened, they lost. Similarly, so this was proven that if we are going to have a war-like scenario with China, we cannot continue to have hostilities with Pakistan. So therefore, back-channel conversation took place, and now the Director General of Military Operations from both the countries, all right, agreed to uphold the 2003 ceasefire agreement. So this agreement is a 3-line, 1-sentence agreement wherein the DGMOs of both the countries agree to not fire shots. That see, we will uphold the LOC, the line of actual control. All right, we will not move beyond it. You will not move inside it. We will not fire shots at each other. All right. So this is the agreement of ceasefire, and it has been upheld for the time being. All right. Will it begin lasting peace between India and Pakistan? We don't know. But what it puts into limelight is the line of control. All right. Why is it important? Because this year is the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh war. All right. It was after the Bangladesh war that the Shimla Pact was signed, which created the LOC. All right. And what does the ceasefire agreement hold? The ceasefire agreement hold that we will not fire shots where? At the LOC. All right. Therefore, this news becomes very important. All right. The Shimla Pact, when was it signed? Where was it signed? Who signed it? Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India back then. All right. So therefore, this is an important issue. Then moving on, a major push for privatization. All right. So this year's, on 2nd February, 1st February this year, the union budget was presented. All right. So the February segment will also be the one where we will discuss important budget analysis. However, see, while the revision series where I am only covering some very important ones which have also been in news later on, the comprehensive budget analysis is you will find on the February 1 newspaper analysis. The budget and policies within it can definitely be forming part of questions in the CLAT examination. At least one passage, all right. So it is my humble request to all the participants, all the viewers right now, if you haven't watched the February 1 newspaper analysis, please go and watch it. That has the most comprehensive union budget analysis. So then moving on, this news is about privatization. So Indian government set out a target that see, we will raise this much amount of revenue by selling our stake in public sector undertaking. What is a public sector undertaking? A public sector undertaking is where the stake or the management control of a company is with the government. All right. However, now the government will be reducing or selling of its stakes to private company, all right, or private investor. This process is known as privatization or disinvestment. So the Indian government has laid a target that see, we will generate this much revenue. There are two primary organizations that they want to disinvest. One is Air India, the other is BPCL. Both are being disinvested for different reasons. Air India has been in debt for almost a decade, all right. So, and where does Air India generate revenue, or who furnishes the debt? It is the taxpayers' money. So the Indian government believes that see, there are better private organizations that can run Air India. We don't have to run an airline anymore. Public sector undertakings were created when in the controlled economy back in 1950s, all right. In 1950s, the private sector in India had almost no money, all right. It was the time when Indian economy had only 11% people who could read and write, all right. So, and having money was impossible because we had just come out of colonialism. In 1990, we liberalized the economy. Different sectors of the country were then given for privatization, all right, or private companies were permitted. Some companies had continued to be under the control of the government, all right. Now, the process of disinvestment has been taking place at different point of time. There was a specific ministry run by Arun Shourie under Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 1999, all right. Now, so this is the target, all right. Why has the government decided? For two reasons. First is to aim expenditure and tax money. If the organization is going into debt, no point of wasting taxpayers' money. The second is to generate revenue. See, Indian economy has been slowing down since 2016, all right. When you slow down, you generate less revenue, but the expenditure requirement of the government increases. When there is a slowdown in the economy, government needs to spend more to actually recoup growth, all right. So this is the irony of economics. When there is a slowdown and you have less revenue, the government is the one that has to generate and spend more. Now, how do you do it? You need money to spend it, right? So therefore, public sector undertakings such as BPCL, which are making profit, all right, they have huge value, so you can sell them off to generate revenue, all right. So this is what the target will be, and the policy of disinvestment. So what are the aim? Now, what is the criticism of a public sector, or why they should not be sold off? So when it is a when it is a public sector undertaking, you provide reservations in employment, all right. The revenue generated is not for profit motive, but actually to distribute or redistribute wealth, all right. So this is the aim of a PSU. The other important aspect of a PSU is that they own strategic national resources of the country. Now, for example, a BPCL organization is a huge one. Common people can't own it, right? But when it is owned by a PSU or is a public sector undertaking, the people have control over it. Now, let's say if Mr. Ambani buys it tomorrow, the resources that BPCL owns, all the petrol pumps, all the land that is under BPCL right now, all the oil fields that BPCL has, all of them will go to the private organization. Mr. Ambani can then tomorrow sell it to Jeff Bezos, and the resources of the country can then go to outside India. So it was the idea of public sector undertaking was also to keep the strategic resources of the country with the people. Already in India, 70% of the wealth is with the rich. So if there is no PSU or any other economic policy to redistribute wealth, then the wealth gap between rich and poor is only going to rise. So this is the aspect of privatization. You can expect a question related to it. Then this year's budget was also presented in a paperless format, all right. COVID-19 pandemic, so you have a chance of contracting COVID by touching surfaces. So our finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman, who is the first formal women finance minister, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had kept the portfolio with her and when presenting. So this was her third budget, all right, and the first paperless budget of India, all right. The finance minister with the one who has presented maximum amount of budgets is Morarji Desai. He had presented 10 budgets. He is also the former Prime Minister of India, all right. Then one more big reform that was presented in the union budget this year was bad banks, all right. Now let's say I had 100 rupees, all right. Bad banks is something we had discussed earlier. I had 100 rupees. I lent 50 to, I decided I will lend 50 rupees to different individual and earn 2% interest over it to generate income for myself. All this 50% was never returned. Also the 2% interest that I was going to earn, that also was never earned, alright. Now I have a problem. Not only have I lost money, I have not made any income for myself, alright. What do banks do? Banks, when they lend, they don't use their own money. They use the depositor's money, all right. So let's say you lend me money. I lend it to someone and I tell you, see, I will give you returns later on. But when I didn't get that money from someone and I lost it, you will claim your money. So two people are losing money, all right? So this is the problem that bad banks face, or public sector banks mostly are facing in the country. So how do you resolve it? You resolve it by doing two things. Either you recoup the debt, all right? You try to recover the debt from the defaulters, all right? So that is a drawn out process. You have the insolvency bankruptcy code. But the other aspect of banks is also they can generate money from the stock market, all right? They can go public, people can buy their stocks, that generates revenue, all right? However, the problem is if a bank has huge debt within it, all right? There is a bank that has zero debt, and then there is a bank that has 50% debt. Whose stock will you buy? You will obviously go for this kind of bank, all right? So thus, a bank that has huge bad debt, all right, or loans that have not been repaid, how can it remove or clean its account books is by transferring the debt that it has to a ARC, or a bad bank. So this will reduce the debt percentage of the bank and let's say make it 100. So then both these banks can generate revenue from the market, all right? So the ARCs this year are going to do exactly this, all right? A bad bank is an asset reconstruction company or asset management, takes over bad loans of commercial banks, manages them and finally recovers the money over a period of time. Bad bank is not involved in taking or lending deposits. They are not commercial banks. They are there to create or take away debt. So this year's budget created a bad bank with capitalization of 20,000 crore rupees, all right? So the government will create an ARC with 20,000 crore rupees, all right? Takeover of bad loans is normally below the book value of loan. That is, if a loan was of 100 rupees, the ARC will only take 80% or 90% of that loan, all right? So it will still show 10% loan on the original bank account. Then another national news this year in month of February were the OTT rules, the Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code, all right? So this will take away the safe harbor principle away. That is, if you are hosting content, you are liable if you are aware that the content is problematic, all right? So this is seen as a reasonable restriction under Article 19. All platforms will now be covered because the rules will relate to digital media. So media could cover social media, digital news platforms, and over-the-top streaming platforms, all right? So this is the do's and don'ts. So social media companies need to find out the first originator who created the message. This is the one that has fallen into controversy. If you send a message, now how all messages will they be seen or surveilled? Is there any privacy left online or not? Appoint a grievance officer to resolve complaints in 15 days. There has to be a dedicated Indian grievance officer to resolve these complaints, and they need to file monthly compliance on complaints taken in the action. Digital news, so for example, the Hindu newspaper or newspapers, magazines that have digital websites, so they fall as digital news. They have to now follow Press Council of India and cable TV network norms, the same norms that apply to TV channels also. It will be self-regulatory body to oversee adherence to code. The IB ministry right now controls the entire mechanism unless the oversight is created. Then lastly, OTT platforms, they have to self-classify their content, which audience is it for, all right? And there will be parental locks that need to be there, plus age verification format. So if you are, for example, I have subscription to Netflix. I have a nephew who is below the age of 18. All right. So if I am, now they need to have separate profiles. If the nephew has to watch, the profile will be separate so that adult content is not accessible to them. All right. Then the last thing in national news is India and China having a disengagement agreement. So in the newspaper analysis in the month of February also, we talked about it. What has China and India done? So in the Pangong Tso area, we have now agreed on disengagement. What have we agreed on? So the conflict was happening at Finger 4 area in the North Bank. China will move to east of Finger 8. We will retain till Finger 3. Area between 3 to 8 will be a no patrol zone. Alright. The Chinese had stopped Indians from patrolling the region up to Finger 8. Alright. We claim the territory beyond Finger 8. Alright. They had stopped at Finger 4 area and built establishments here. So those establishments will be done away with. Then in counter to this, to China coming on the north, we had taken heights on the south. Alright, at Rechingla, Rizangla. Alright, this area is known as the Kailash Hill region. So we captured the heights. Earlier we were not on the heights. We established establishments here. We will have to raise down our establishment and go back to the plain area. So this is the disengagement that we have agreed upon. The conflict right now is still going on in other regions. All right, so that is the Depsang Plains, the Hot Spring area, the Gogra Hills, and the Galwan Valley. So all those 4 areas, there is engagement between India and China still ongoing. All right, so in this regard, what can be asked as questions? What is the disengagement? Where did it take place? Who was involved? So the commander names from Indian side and Chinese side become important. The foreign minister of India and China, defense minister of India and China become very important. So this is the national news segment. See you all in the international news segment of February in the next one.